I want to tell you about the quietest robbery I've ever lived through, and the strange part is that nobody ever raised their voice. There was no broken window, no mask, no man in the dark. Just a gift, a smile, and a few weeks of me believing I was loved when I was actually being measured for a box. Before I get into it, I'll ask you to do one thing. Don't sit there deciding who the villain is too early. Just put yourself in my chair and ask honestly what you'd have done, because I promise you the warning signs are gentler than you think. They don't bang on the door. They knock soft and they bring something nice. The morning everything finally landed on me, I was sitting in a glass-walled boardroom on the second floor of a bank branch on the Sella Boulevard, here in Sudbury, with my winter coat still zipped halfway because nobody had thought to turn the heat up. There was a little digital picture frame on the table between us. White plastic. The kind that scrolls through photos on its own. My son-in-law had given it to me, loaded with shots of my granddaughter, and I'd kept it on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks like a fool. Now it sat there in the middle of that table like a thing pulled out of a riverbed, and I could not take my eyes off it. The woman from the bank was talking, my daughter was crying without making any noise, and I just stared at that frame thinking about every single word I'd said in my own kitchen while it watched me with its little eye. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where it started, which was a Tuesday in late February on my 63rd birthday. I've lived in the same part of Sudbury for 31 years, in a 1.5-story on a street where every house was poured from the same mold back when the mines were hiring. Vinyl siding, a driveway you have to shovel twice before noon, a maple out front that drops a metric ton of keys every spring. I worked maintenance at Health Sciences North for most of my life, then took a part-time job after I semi-retired, keeping the boiler and the compressors and the ice plant running at the community arena off Bancroft. People think a building runs itself. It doesn't. There's always a man somewhere in the basement listening for the sound a machine makes right before it quits. For 40 years, that man was me, and I got good at noticing when something was about to go wrong. Which is the part that still keeps me up at night. I can hear a bad bearing through 2 floors of concrete, but I couldn't hear what was happening at my own kitchen table. My wife passed 2 winters ago. Cancer. Fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to make peace with anything. After 38 years, the house got very loud in that way. An empty house gets loud, every clock and every pipe, suddenly with something to say. My daughter started checking in more after that, which I was grateful for. She's my only child. She married a fellow about 6 years back, and I'll be honest, I never warmed to him the way you're supposed to. Nothing I could point at. He shook your hand a half-second too long. He remembered things about you that you didn't remember telling him. He always seemed to be doing math behind his eyes. But he was good to my daughter, or seemed to be, and he was the father of my granddaughter, so I kept my mouth shut and passed the gravy at Thanksgiving like everybody does. That birthday morning, my daughter forgot. She remembered around 3 in the afternoon and called all flustered, and I told her it was fine. Don't worry about it, I'm not exactly throwing a party at 63. But it stung more than I let on. You spend your whole life being the one who fixes the furnace and drives people to the airport at 4 in the morning. And then one year, your own kid forgets the day you were born, and you feel yourself sliding toward the back of everybody's mind. That's the soil this whole thing grew in, I think. Loneliness. A man who'd started to wonder if he still mattered to anyone. So when a package showed up that same afternoon from my son-in-law of all people, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Noticed. Wanted even. Inside was the picture frame, and a card in his blocky handwriting that said, "So you've always got the kids with you, Pops. Happy birthday." And it played a slideshow of my granddaughter at the splash pad in her snowsuit, asleep with a freezy melting down her wrist. I'm not ashamed to tell you I sat at my kitchen table and got a little misty over a $40 gadget. I plugged it in by the toaster and let it run, and the house felt less empty for the first time in a long while. A few days later, I brought my phone into the arena to show one of the guys the photos. And that's where it started to come apart. There's a young fellow there named Curtis who handles all the cameras and the sound system and the Wi-Fi for the building. Sharp kid, used to work installing security systems before he came to us. I was bragging about the frame and he asked what brand it was, and I said I didn't know, no name on it. My son-in-law gave it to me. Curtis got a funny look. He asked if the frame had ever asked me to connect it to an app on my phone. It hadn't. He asked who'd set it up. My son-in-law had brought it over already running. Curtis didn't say much right then. But the next afternoon, he came down to the boiler room where I was bleeding a line and he said, "Bring that frame in tomorrow. I want to look at it." I laughed at him. I asked if he thought there was a bomb in it. He didn't laugh back. He said, "I think somebody's set it up to listen to you, and I want to be wrong." That night, I didn't sleep right. I told myself Curtis was a kid who watched too much true crime. But there's a particular cold that comes over you when a person you trust says something serious in a flat voice and you can't shake it. I lay there listening to the furnace cycle on and off, and for the first time in 3 weeks I was very aware of that little frame glowing in the kitchen, scrawling through my granddaughter, all by itself, in the dark. I brought it in. Curtis took it into the office and put it under a desk lamp and turned it over in his hands the way I turn over a part I don't trust. He popped the back off with a guitar pick. And he went quiet in a way I didn't like. He showed me a second little board tucked in behind the screen that he said had no business being there, and a pinhole next to the sensor, and he said the thing was reaching out over the building Wi-Fi to some address he didn't recognize, sending little packets out at intervals all day long. "This isn't a picture frame anymore," he said. "Somebody turned it into a wire." Then he said the sentence that changed my life. "You need to take this to the police." So I did. On my lunch the next day, I drove down to the detachment, frame in a Sobeys bag on the passenger seat, and I felt ridiculous the whole way, like an old man about to waste the city's time over a gadget. The constable at the desk took my information, and eventually a detective came out, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses pushed up in her hair, and she took the frame into the back. I sat in a plastic chair for the better part of an hour. At one point I heard, faintly through the wall, a recording playing back, and I swear to you I heard my own voice, muffled, saying something about putting out the recycling. My stomach went down a hole. The detective came back with a younger fellow, the technical type, the kind who doesn't waste words. She set the frame on the table in front of me. "This has been modified," she said. "It's capturing audio in the room and uploading it. It's been doing it since it was switched on." I asked the only question I could form. I asked who was listening. She didn't answer me. Instead, she asked me where I kept it. In the kitchen, I told her, on the counter by the toaster. And then she asked the question that took the floor out from under me. She asked what I talked about in my kitchen. I had to sit with it, because the answer was everything. I'm a man who lives alone and talks to himself. I read my mail out loud at that counter. I'd called my buddy from there about the cottage my wife and I had near Killarney, whether I should hang on to it or sell it now that she was gone. I'd talked to a fellow about my RIF, what to draw down, what the tax hit would be. I'd stood at that counter and said out loud more than once that since my wife died, I sometimes forgot whether I'd taken my blood pressure pill, and that I'd started writing it on the calendar so I wouldn't double up. 3 weeks of a man's whole private life said aloud into a microphone disguised as a gift from his granddaughter. "Don't change anything," the detective told me. "Don't confront anyone. Keep living exactly the way you have been. We need to understand what they're after before they realize you know." Then she said I could take the frame home and keep it running, or leave it with them, and something in me, some stubborn thing, said I'd take it home. I wanted to think. I drove back to the arena with that bag on the seat, and I didn't hear a word anybody said to me the rest of the day. For the next 2 nights, I went back and forth like a man arguing with himself in an empty car, which is exactly what I was. Part of me wanted to drive over to my daughter's place, set the frame on her table, and ask my son-in-law to his face what in God's name he thought he was doing. But every time I got close to that, the detective's voice came back. If you confront him now, he'll deny it. He'll cry victim. He'll tell your daughter you're getting paranoid, and whatever he's planning will go underground where we can't reach it. And there was a worse thought underneath that one I didn't want to look at straight. My daughter. How much did she know? Because the only people who'd ever stood in my kitchen while I talked were me and the people I loved. So I made a decision that I'm still not entirely proud of. I decided that if somebody wanted to listen to me so badly, I'd give them something worth hearing. I'd test it the way I test a system. You don't accuse a boiler of being broken, you feed it an input and you watch what comes out. That first morning, I plugged the frame back in before I'd even put the coffee on, and I'll tell you the truth. The shameful part is that a piece of me was curious. Like touching a wire you've been told is still live. I didn't make any calls. I just moved around the kitchen the way I always do, let the house wake up, and then, standing there in my socks on the cold lino, I said out loud like I was thinking to myself that my buddy figured the cottage might finally sell in the spring, and if it did, I'd probably just roll the whole thing into the house, pay it right down. Then I left for work and waited. It didn't take a day. That afternoon, my phone buzzed at the arena. My son-in-law, who never texts me, asking all casual whether I'd given any more thought to that cottage near Killarney, said my daughter had mentioned it once and it got him wondering. My hands went cold standing there by the Zamboni. But I typed back slow and easy, said I was still figuring it out, no rush. Then I went and fixed a door closer on the dressing room and drank a bad coffee and tried to act like a man whose whole world hadn't just tilted on its side. Nothing exploded, the day just went on. Somehow that was worse. That's how it went for a couple of weeks, and I'll tell you, it was the strangest, ugliest stretch of time I've ever lived through. Every evening I'd come home and feed the line. I'd talk to nobody about how my memory wasn't what it used to be, about how I'd missed a hydro payment and got a notice and felt like an idiot, about how maybe I should let somebody help me with the banking, that it was getting to be a lot to keep track of. I made myself sound smaller and more confused every day, and every time the response came. A text from my son-in-law offering to drive me to appointments. A call where he just happened to bring up that a buddy of his was a financial advisor who was great with seniors. My daughter relaying things. He says, "You've been forgetting your pills, Dad. Are you okay? Should we be worried?" And every time she said something like that, it landed like a stone, because I knew where she'd heard it. Nobody had been in my kitchen. Nobody had heard me say those things but the frame. I hated every word of it. I'd lie in bed afterward feeling filthy, like I was the one doing something wrong, lying to my own daughter on purpose, making myself into a man falling apart so I could catch the people who wanted me to fall apart. There were nights I nearly quit the whole thing just to feel clean again. But then I'd picture that frame on the cold table at the detachment. And I'd think about how close I'd come to never knowing. To just smiling and signing whatever they put in front of me. Grateful for the help. And I'd get up the next morning and put the frame back on the counter. I pushed it too far once. I came in from the cold one night, stamped the snow off my boots, and said out loud, irritated with myself that I'd nearly forgotten to pay the property taxes, that I just couldn't keep dates straight anymore. The second it was out of my mouth, I knew I'd overdone it. And sure enough, 2 days later, my daughter called and asked, gentle as anything, whether I'd been keeping up with the house, because my son-in-law had mentioned he was worried I might lose track of something important. There it was, proof in my hand, and a wound right beside it. She wasn't just passing along his concern. She believed it. They'd built a story about a confused old man, and they'd told it to her, and she'd swallowed it whole. The thing that turned my stomach to ice, though, the thing I found by accident, was in my own basement. I'd gone down to look at the furnace, which actually was rattling, and while I was down there I opened the old steel filing cabinet my wife and I had hauled through 3 houses, the one with the drawer that sticks. I was after the cottage deed, just to look at it, and tucked in behind the insurance binders was a folder that didn't belong to me. Too new. Too clean. I opened it standing right there on the concrete with the furnace sticking beside me, and I read every page twice. There were printouts. A draft of a continuing power of attorney for property mine, naming my son-in-law to handle my money. A blank capacity assessment form, the kind a doctor fills out when they're deciding whether a person can manage their own affairs. Notes about the office of the public guardian and trustee, about how to apply to have someone declared incapable, and underneath all that, paperwork from a reverse mortgage company, the kind that advertises during the afternoon news telling seniors they can unlock the cash in their home, with my address typed into it and a balance owing on my house that I have never owed in my life because I burned that mortgage 15 years ago. In the margins, in my son-in-law's square handwriting, little notes. Dad forgetful redates. Missed hydro, book doctor, poor assessment. Talk to mom, get her on side. Get her on side. My wife's been gone 2 years. There's only one mom in this story. My daughter. He was working on my daughter the way he was working on me, and the difference was that I'd figured it out and she hadn't. I sat down on the bottom step and I didn't move for a long time. Because this was never about a gadget or even about money, not really. The money was just the prize. The plan was to erase me, to take a man who can hear a failing bearing through 2 floors of concrete and stamp a form that says he can't be trusted to manage his own life, and then quietly hand his house and his savings and his name to somebody else and have him so grateful for the help that he holds the pen himself. I called the detective from the basement. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a long breath and said the part that frightened me most. She said the surveillance plus the capacity paperwork together was the dangerous combination, because the recordings were the ammunition. You take 3 weeks of a lonely man saying he forgets things. You cut it together, you play it for a doctor or a judge, and you've manufactured your incapable person out of nothing but his own loneliness. Whatever you do, she said, don't sign anything and don't let anyone book you a doctor's appointment you didn't ask for. The week after that, I made my one real mistake, and it was a bad one. A new officer looked at my file, a younger guy, and when he heard there was no money actually gone yet, he sort of shrugged and called it a family dispute, said these things were a mess, that I should maybe just talk it out with my family. I drove home from there so angry my hands were shaking on the wheel, and instead of waiting, instead of doing what I'd done so carefully for weeks, I called my son-in-law directly. I didn't yell, but I asked him point blank why he'd been calling a reverse mortgage company about my house. There was a long pause on the line. And then, smooth as anything, he said he was just looking into options for me, that he was trying to help, that my daughter had asked him to keep an eye on my finances, and then he hung up. For 3 days, nothing. No texts, no calls, no soup on the doorstep. And I was sure I'd blown the whole thing, tipped him off, scared him underground exactly like the detective warned. The silence was worse than any of it. I sat in that quiet house every night, certain I'd ruined my one chance to save myself. Then the email came. From my son-in-law to me, subject line family meeting, next steps. Polite, reasonable. He suggested we all sit down together at the bank, said it would be less overwhelming for me to have everyone there, listed the documents I should bring, my RIF statements, the house papers, my will. And at the very bottom, like an afterthought, he wrote that he'd spoken to my daughter and she agreed this was for the best. I read it 4 times. And then I understood that he'd handed me the very thing I needed. He'd put it in writing, his name on it, the meeting, the documents, the claim that my daughter was on board. I forwarded the whole thing to the detective and to the bank's fraud line, and this time, with the email and the basement folder and the recordings the police had already pulled off the frame, somebody finally listened. The tone changed completely. A meeting got booked, not the kind my son-in-law was expecting. The night before, I drove out to my daughter's place. I decided she needed to hear it from me before she walked into that room and had her life pulled out from under her. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table I'd built her a high chair for 30 years ago, and I laid it all out. The frame, the recordings, the folder in my basement with her mother's filing cabinet, the reverse mortgage with a balance I never owed. I watched her face go from confusion to disbelief to something I'll never forget. The moment a person realizes the man they share a bed with has been using them as a tool. She cried the way you cry when you can't get a full breath. She kept saying she didn't know, that he'd told her I'd been slipping, that he'd shown her the missed hydro notice, that she'd believed him because why wouldn't she believe her own husband about her own father? I told her I knew, and I did know. That was the hardest part. She wasn't a villain, she was the second mark. The bank boardroom was smaller than I'd built it up to be in my head. A long laminate table, chairs that didn't match, a pot of coffee that had clearly been sitting on the burner since before I was born. My son-in-law got there first in a nice gray jacket with a leather folder in front of him like a man who'd come to close a deal. He nodded at me, friendly, like we were two fellows waiting on a mortgage renewal. My daughter came in last and sat down beside him because she didn't know how not to, and her hands were shaking in her lap. There was a woman from the bank, the fraud investigator, calm and pleasant, and off to the side, in a chair against the wall with a notebook closed on her knee, the detective. And in the center of the table, where the woman from the bank had set it down without a word, was that little white picture frame. The woman started gentle. She asked my son-in-law to confirm a few things: the calls to the reverse mortgage company, the inquiry he'd made at the branch about a line of credit against my house, the appointment request he'd put into my doctor's office. He answered every one of them smooth as glass, said he'd been helping his father-in-law, that I'd been overwhelmed since my wife passed, that I'd asked him to take some of the load off. He even glanced at me, sympathetic, selling it. I didn't say anything. I let him talk. Then the woman slid a page across the table and asked whether I'd ever signed a power of attorney granting him authority over my finances. He said we discussed it. She said that was interesting because I hadn't signed a thing, and yet he'd represented himself to her own bank as a man acting on my behalf. The detective leaned forward then for the first time and said that representing yourself as someone's financial agent when you aren't is a serious matter, and modifying a device to record a person without their knowledge is another one entirely. My daughter turned to him. She asked him what device, and the woman from the bank pressed a button on a little recorder on the table, and the room filled with my own voice, thin and tired, talking about forgetting my pills, talking about not being able to keep dates straight. My son-in-law's face changed. He asked where that came from. The detective nodded at the frame in the center of the table and said, "From the gift you gave him." He stood up. He said this was ridiculous, that I twisted everything, that I'd never liked him, that I was a bitter old man who'd never accepted him. And I stayed in my chair, and I said the only true thing I had. I told him I didn't dislike him. I told him I'd handed him my daughter and my granddaughter and trusted him with both, and I'd have given him anything he ever asked for if he just asked. The woman from the bank slid one last sheet across the table. An email he'd sent, not to me, to himself. A note he'd made, and it said in his own words that once the old man signed, the rest would be easy, that I'd never even clue in to what I'd lost. The room went very still. My daughter read it. She put her hand over her mouth, and whatever was left between them died right there on a laminate table in a bank, with cold coffee going to skin in the pot. Nobody shouted. The detective stood and asked my son-in-law to come with her, and he looked at me on his way out, and he said, "You did this." And I told him, no. I told him he did. They walked him out without cuffs, and the boardroom felt like the air had been let out of it. My daughter cried into her hands, and I didn't reach for her, not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't have it in me yet. The frame sat there on the table, still scrolling. My granddaughter at the splash pad, my granddaughter at the splash pad, my granddaughter asleep with a freezy. I picked it up. I turned it over in my hands one last time, that little second board behind the screen. And as I got to the door, I stopped and I said the only thing that felt right. I told him he should have just brought a card. Then I went out into the parking lot, into a wind coming off the snowbanks sharp enough to make your eyes run. And for the first time in a month and a half, my hands were steady. The weeks after were quiet, and not the bad kind. My daughter and I didn't fix everything in one big tearful afternoon, because that's not how real things mend. We fixed it the way you fix anything that matters, slow, a little at a time. Over coffee at the Tim's by the arena, over me teaching my granddaughter how to flood a backyard rink the way I taught her mother. My daughter said sorry more times than I needed to hear it. I didn't rush to forgive, but I didn't make her grovel either. At my age, you learn the difference between something that's broken and something that's just changed shape. And a father and a daughter are the second kind almost always. I did the boring, important things. I went and saw a lawyer and put my affairs in proper order, named my daughter and a fellow I trust from the curling club as the two who'd have to agree before anything happened to my money. So no one person could ever do this again. I documented that I was of sound mind, got it from my own doctor, dated and signed, so that no clipped-together recording could ever say otherwise. I changed every password I had. And if you take one thing from an old man who learned it the hard way, take that one. While you're still sharp, write down who's allowed to speak for you. Put it where you can find it, and put a second honest person between your name and anyone who'd want to use it. The people who do this don't come at you with a crowbar. They come with paperwork and a soft voice and a story about how much they just want to help. I don't keep anything that listens in my house anymore. No smart speaker, no fancy frame, nothing with a little glowing eye. My granddaughter thinks her grandpa's hopeless, and she's right. But there's a corkboard by my kitchen door now, and it's covered in actual photographs of her, the paper kind, that can't hear a single word I say. I look at them every morning while the coffee drips, and I talk to myself the way I always have, about the cottage and the boiler, and whether the wolves have a chance this year, and the only thing in that kitchen listening to me is me. People ask if I'm angry, and the strange answer is, not really, not anymore. What stays with me isn't the money he tried to take, because he never got $1 of it. It's how close it came, and how gentle it was. How it arrived wrapped in pictures of a child I love, with a card that called me Pops. I spent my whole life listening for the sound a thing makes right before it breaks, and the one machine I never thought to check was the one that came to me as a present. So all I'll leave you with is this: when something feels off, even when it comes from someone you'd swear you could trust, especially then, slow down. Ask the question, look behind the screen. It is not paranoia to protect yourself, and it is not unkind to want to know who's listening. The loudest dangers in my life never hurt me. It was the quiet one that nearly took everything, and it knocked so softly I almost held the door open and thanked it on the way in.